All right, here we go. We are on the third subheading, Formation of a Bipolar World. We're now at Cold War society. So, again, we're broken off into blocks, and we've got much of the world is having to decide between the first world, which is the United States and Western Europe and democratic capitalism, and the second world, which is the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, so on and so forth, some satellite states. Now, what was it like? Well, to be honest, even from the get, it was much better in the United States than it was in the Soviet Union because of the United States' industrial capacity, due to the fact that we hadn't had war on our soil, due to the fact that we had a progressive tax structure, which charged more taxes to the rich. The rich were still definitely rich; they just weren't stupid rich. Due to the fact that between that helped to fund social programs, and there was a relatively high amount of labor union membership, allowed people in the United States to have this American dream, where just the man could go to work and the woman could stay home to help raise the kids. And there was a lot of consumer products that were being created by the United States, which seemed like superfluous in the Soviet Union. Again, the Soviet Union um, was a planned economy. So basically, they decided what was built and who built it and how much everyone got paid. If you were absolutely perfect, then great. But no one's perfect except for my wife and daughter. So that they were eventually doomed to fail. So the United States was very scared of this type of communist government, though, and for good reason. It's why today there are people who cannot accept anybody who would claim to be socialist, especially my generation or the generations before that. It is unfathomable to them because of the controlled central planning that was done by the Soviets and the lack of freedom of speech and the totalitarianism. And so in the 50s, we had what was called the Red Scare, which basically meant that there was a senator who kind of led the push named Joseph McCarthy, that there was this huge, vast communist conspiracy of spies. And again, there were some spies. One of the reasons why nuclear weapons fell into Soviet hands was partially because of spies. But he claimed that there were thousands of spies, and that there was this kind of secret underground movement, similar to what you would call Antifa. There was the same type of ideas, how they kind of demonized these potential people. Eventually, we're going to find out that McCarthy was full of McCarthy, and they stopped listening to him. But he still there. It kind of shows kind of the paranoia going on at the time. The other issue that was happening is, for all its great things, democratic capitalism had some issues. One of which was, as things got better, and people had the ability to have just one wage earner, which is spectacular. Um, that usually was the man, and usually the women were kind of left to do um, the domestic things. There was an even stronger amount of patriarchy that women had to contend with back then, where they were supposed to just go from being a daughter to being a wife. And for some women, they just didn't want that life. They didn't want to be June Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver. They wanted to have their own career. They didn't want to be henpecked or always be dependent on a man. And so there are a few things that are going to come up during this time, including the second sex from France, and then the Betty Friedan, a U.S. author, creates the feminine mystique, and that really just kind of shows and gave voice to this kind of yearning a lot of women were feeling, that they were being treated like second class citizens, which was wrong, clearly. And so another group that was being treated wrongly was specifically African Americans, Latin Americans, and Asians too. But the focus here is in the book is African Americans. And so, happening in the United States, happening in the Caribbean, happening in Africa, we had this rejection of colonialism and of slavery, which we would consider Black nationalism. So you might have heard of Bob Marley's "Get Up, Stand Up," which just is, I don't know, I'm not cool, but is a jam. But it's more than just a jam. It's an anthem for people to get up and stand up for themselves, to fight for their rights, to not give up the fight. And so what happens is we have a lot of leaders which start to pop up, who start to reject this exploitation that capitalism does create. And Marcus Garvey is another famous one, who from Jamaica, and he actually wanted Africans, descendants of African slaves, to go back to Africa, just to be separate. And so we'll have another leader here, which I'll talk about in just a second. Another thing that ends up happening is, so this exploitation of women and of African Americans, especially, the Soviets just jump on, because in good communism, all people are equal, no matter your gender, no matter your race. And so the United States, does start to change a little bit in little fits. We're going to have the U.S. Supreme Court is going to rule against segregation in something called Brown versus Board of Education. Before that, there was a court case where they said basically separate is fine as long as things are equal. In Brown versus Board of Education, the argument is made that separate inherently means things are unequal. So fortunately, that's going to happen. We're also going to have Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King are going to bring up peaceful ways to protest. That doesn't mean they aren't angry. It means that, though, people are going to stand up and demand that they have the right to vote, they have the rights to equality, because again, the United States, even more so than today, had a lot of had a huge racist issue, especially in the South. It was very, very blatant in the South, although it definitely was in the West and the North as well, depending on the city. But still, these were issues, and so that's going to be something in your AP US history. You'll learn much more about the Civil Rights Act that's going to be passed during this time period. Still not done, but better. Another thing to note as well is just the amount of consumerism that's going to increase. Things like pop culture, rock and roll, Hollywood, all of these things are going to start to and be emerging from the West, and it's going to be very addicting to people around the planet. A part of this is going to be possible because of that U.S. Marshall Plan we talked about last chapter. But even though they fall behind in like kind of consumerism, the Soviet Union and planned economy is very efficient at smaller scale things, including the space race, when you can kind of move down into something very scientific. And so there's a few things that Soviet technology is going to create, which is going to very much concern people in the West. The ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, which allows you to fire missiles much farther and still accurately. They're going to have the first satellite in Sputnik. They're going to have the first man around the planet orbit the Earth is going to be Gagarin. And that in the United States is going to cause a huge jump in what we would call STEMs and the STEM sciences or subjects, science and technology, engineering and math. And so John F. Kennedy famously is going to do what we would now call a moonshot. That comes from the idea that J.F. Kennedy said, we are going to land someone on the moon. He's going to create NASA. And it's actually going to happen within a decade. So one of the interesting things to note whenever we talk about the Cold War is that in many ways, there was a lot of tension, but there was relative peace between the two groups. Both countries had either McCarthyism in the United States, which was very anti-communist, but in the Soviet Union it was even worse for people who sympathized with capitalist democracy. And so through this, there's a lot of tension, a lot of strain, but we're going to have these moments where we're going to see that each other are human, and that's going to be one of the things that's going to help us make sure that the Cold War never turns hot.